Good evening, everyone. Thank you for making time to come along to this talk. I hope that you will learn something useful tonight. And I'm going to give a talk that will go on for about 45 minutes. And at the end of that, we should have some time for Q&A. So we'd like everyone to come forward if you have comments or questions, or if you would like to just share your experiences with everyone tonight. We welcome also people who are not members of the group, and you are very much welcome tonight at this talk. Being someone who deals with death and dying on a day-to-day basis does not make me a better person or a worse person than the rest of you when it comes to facing death and mortality. And in cancer work, death is not always the only outcome. And so therefore, we need to remember that if you get cancer, you're not 100% going to die from cancer. I think it's 100% that you will die eventually, but it may not be from cancer. You may beat your cancer. But when we talk about cancer, death does happen often. And we acknowledge this. We may not like it. We are frightened by the prospect of death, but we should not run away from it. We know that human life may end very suddenly, or human life may end after a period of months or years during which you are ill and during which there is a period of caregiving. And just as we shouldn't turn away from the topic of death, we should also not run away from the topic of caregiving. Whenever there is illness, and certainly when there is cancer, there is always caregiving. Tonight, our talk is about one aspect of caregiving, and the aspect that I'm going to talk about is burnout. To get started, we should look at the two terms that we're dealing with tonight. The first term is caregiving, and the second term is burnout. I think most of us have some idea what burnout means, and some of us here may have experienced burnout. And certainly in the recent Straits Times article, we have a story about doctors and burnout. And the title of this article is "More Doctors in Singapore Face Burnout Anxiety Amid the Pandemic." The article goes on to tell us really that because of the COVID pandemic, doctors in Singapore show signs of increased burnout and psychological distress. And you see that word burnout in red over here. If you have the opportunity to read this article, you will see more details about this topic. And I would just highlight the words in red there. 82% of doctors had symptoms of burnout. And this was a study that was published by the Institute of Mental Health. In the succeeding part of the article, we are told, interestingly, that burnout is not classified as a mental illness under the DSM-5. This may surprise you because you may think that burnout is a mental illness, but strictly speaking, it is not. It is not distinctive enough to be considered an illness. It is not disparate enough from, say, anxiety or depression for it to stand alone as a mental illness. So therefore, strictly speaking, burnout is not a disease condition. It is very much popular jargon. And so therefore, we shouldn't look at burnout as if it was an illness. But the important thing to remember is that although it is not a disease, we readily acknowledge that if burnout is not addressed, it can affect a person's mental well-being and lead to issues that would affect their work performance and their productivity. Tonight, we're not really talking about doctors and health professionals. We're talking about caregivers. And I showed you that article in the Straits Times just to introduce the topic of burnout, to serve as a kind of lead-in into the topic. And now we shall begin talking about caregiver burnout. It's really not the same thing. And I would like to just briefly and quickly discuss the differences between a caregiver's burnout and a burnout that health professionals experience. So first of all, there is a difference between a professional person and a non-professional person. The differences lie in the areas of knowledge, the volume of knowledge, the depth of knowledge regarding the illness, the treatment, the prognosis is vastly different. And therefore, this changes the character of the stress and the burnout that the two groups face. Then the second thing that is different between the healthcare professional and the caregiver is the emotional aspect. The healthcare workers, the doctors and the nurses, tend to be less emotionally tied to the patient. And we all appreciate that this is often helpful and needful, although in a few instances, it may become a problem. Now, let me explain this a little bit more. Now, I've been a doctor for 38 years, and I am vastly more experienced today than I was before. I am more mature, and I'm a better doctor than I was when I first started 38 years ago. I have not lost any compassion. In fact, my compassion has deepened. And I know some of you have heard me say this before. My deepening compassion for my patients is possible because I have learned the importance of being careful with my emotions. Now, on the other hand, the intensity and the rawness of the emotions of the caregiver, particularly caregivers who are relatives, the rawness of these emotions can sometimes, in fact, often become a problem. You see, the caregiver sometimes is at risk of losing objectivity. He is, because of being drawn into the whole situation, he often loses objectivity. And the caregiver's emotion affects his job of caring. And the emotions that the caregiver feels are sometimes projected onto the patient. And this projection of the emotions can sometimes wear the patient out. And we know that the emotional caregiver is sometimes at risk of making poor decisions. But we must also, at the same time, remember that this intense emotion actually keeps the caregiver going and going and going. The overpowering ocean of emotions does sometimes wear down the soul, but it is often the fire that keeps the caregiver going, providing uninterrupted care and love to the patient. Now, we're going to go through some very important facts about caregiving. So caregiving is an important public health issue that affects the quality of life for thousands of individuals. Caregivers provide assistance with another person's social needs and health needs. And caregiving may include help with one or more activities important for daily living, such as bathing and dressing, paying the bills, shopping, and providing transportation. These are some of the roles of the caregiver. And the caregiver often also provides emotional support and help with managing a chronic disease or disability. Your caregiving responsibilities can increase and change as the recipient's needs increase, and this may result in additional strain on the caregiver. And who are the caregivers? This is a very easy question to answer. Caregivers are very often unpaid family members or unpaid friends, or they may be paid caregivers that you employ. All these groups of people are people who play the role of caregivers. And then we should acknowledge that the informal caregivers or unpaid caregivers are the backbone of long-term care provided in many homes. And then, of course, in particular, caregivers themselves are not often young people. The caregivers are often middle-aged or older adults who provide a substantial portion of the care And here we're talking about the US. They are responsible for caring for children, parents, and spouses. Some more facts. Okay, caregiving can affect the caregiver's life in a myriad of ways, including his ability to work. And sometimes you may have to give up your job in order to provide care for someone. It affects your ability to engage in social interactions and relationships. You may not be able to meet your friends every Sunday anymore. And caregiving can sometimes affect your physical health and your mental health. But on the other hand, we ought to also remember that caregiving can sometimes bring great satisfaction to you. Caregiving strengthens the relationship with the recipient or with the recipient's family. And this is largely because you see the way you have been of help to the family and to the recipient. And of course, as the population changes and as disability worsens, it is critical to understand the burden on caregivers, the range of tasks that caregivers may perform, and also the economic impacts of long-term chronic diseases and disability. Now, I think most of us who have been caregivers tend to approach it as a very individual experience. And this is understandable. You're not a policy maker. You don't understand how to make policy. You've never had a chance to look at Singapore's needs. But if you step back, this is really the whole picture, not just in Singapore, but in every country around the world. Now, some more facts about caregiving. So there is regular care and assistance to a friend or a family member with a health problem or disability. And we know, and these are statistics from the US, 1 in 5 adults are caregivers. 61% are women. And so therefore men do not form the large part of caregivers. But of course, we have men in Singapore who are the caregivers. 22% are 65-year-old persons or older. And the recipient of the care is often a parent or a parent-in-law. And 20% of caregivers are providing care to people with dementia. And in an aging society like Singapore, dementia is a growing problem that we will, as a country, have to deal with. We are already dealing with dementia as best as we can, but this is likely to be a bigger and bigger problem in the future. Now, even for those of us who are not caregivers at the moment, 1 in 7 non-caregivers can expect to become caregivers within 2 years, and that is a sobering thought. So what do caregivers do? This study in the US showed that over 75% of these caregivers manage household tasks. And then about 40% will assist with personal care. And we'll talk a bit about what personal care means. And I will tell you what they are so that you have a clear picture of what it really means. It's the ugly side of caregiving. It is cleaning up. It is the unpleasant things that very few of us like to be responsible for. Caregiving can also, at the same time, be very lengthy. It's, of course, not easy to define what lengthy is, but half of caregivers have provided care for at least 2 years. And we're not talking about professional caregivers. We are talking about unpaid caregivers. They have been caught in the role of caregiver for at least 2 years, and this is going to go on and on. And the caregiving can sometimes be very intense, and over 1/4 have provided care for at least 20 hours per week. So it is often relentless, it is tough. It is not just saying hello and how are you today. It is not just sitting next to the person and saying a 3-minute prayer for that person. It may be 3 hours of hard work with the person that you're caring for. Now, so those are figures that I've taken mostly from the US. In Singapore, we also have figures. I haven't shown you the Singapore figures, but there are many people in Singapore who are interested in caregiving, and these are the sociologists, the social scientists, the healthcare professionals, the clergy, the church. Every one of these groups have a stake in the problem of caregiving. This lovely picture of the happy family, and we have, who do we have here? We have grandfather, we have grandmother, we have mother, we have father, we have 2 young children. And this is obviously the archetypal picture of the happy family. And we're all familiar with pictures like this. Advertisers love these pictures. Annual reports feature these pictures. Organizations and CEOs love these pictures. But happy families are sometimes a myth. And I'm not being cynical here, but happy families, intact families, are not always present in every instance. And we cannot get started on our work if we don't get past the false assumptions. Okay, so what exactly do I mean? I think caregiving would be less of a problem if you have a spouse, or if you have grown-up children who can take care of you. But if you have no spouse, if you have no children, if your family is broken, then caregiving can become a nightmare. And certainly in Singapore, these changes in society are becoming more prevalent. For example, you may have fathers who leave their families very early on. You may have mothers who are forced to take on 2 jobs, who really struggle to bring up their children. And you may have families that have a prodigal son, to borrow an image from the Bible, a son or a daughter who has left the family, and therefore the dynamics and the intactness of the family is no longer present. We also in Singapore, and certainly in the West, we have people who now have lost faith in the institution of marriage. And so therefore, they're not going to get married. They're just going to live together and not get married. And so therefore, the family structure has changed. And therefore, you may not be able to count on help when you need help. And so therefore, these are some of the issues that planners would always take into consideration. I'm going to just share a few more facts about caregiving. First of all, the need for caregivers is going to grow because of the aging of our populations. And as we've said, many people who are not currently caregivers will be expected to become caregivers in the future. And certainly the length of time that you are expected to become a caregiver can go on for a long time, 6 months or more. And if you're someone who has a job and suddenly the job of caregiving is thrust upon you, you will find that you will have to make immense adjustments to your life. Okay, and then we ought to remember that as our caregivers become older, they too may not be in the best of health, and therefore they may experience an impact on their own health as they care for other people. And so therefore, you know, if you're a planner, you have to think strategically and come up with a system that will take care not just of people who need caring, but the caregivers and everyone else who is involved. Okay, so what can we do as societies and as governments? I think most societies and governments know that they need to increase messaging that it emphasizes both the important role of caregivers and the importance of maintaining caregivers' health and well-being. Most governments know that we need to educate the public about caregiving before they they become caregivers, and we need to tell people what are the resources available to them so that they can take on the role. We want to tell people about the risks that they take on when they become caregivers. And we want to train people so that they can become effective caregivers who can contribute well to the people that they're caring for. Then, of course, if you're a planner, you need to find out what is the gap between what is reality and what is needed to support people with dementia or disability. And of course, we want to provide programs if they're not already available, and services if they're not available. And then we want to tell people about these programs that are available. And I'm just going to stop here and talk about this word, evidence-based programs. Okay, evidence-based programs. I don't know whether this is a new word for some of us here tonight, but it is an idea, a concept that has been around for, I think, about 2 decades, and it drives all of modern medicine today. So I'm going to show you some information about what evidence-based medicine is. Evidence-based medicine is the conscientious, explicit, judicious, and reasonable use of modern best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. So basically, evidence-based policy making or evidence medicine argues that that good evidence should exist to document the effectiveness of a program or a treatment or a test. And evidence-based medicine is a set of principles that are intended to ensure that to the greatest extent possible, medical decisions, guidelines, and other types of policies are based on and consistent with good evidence of effectiveness and benefit. Now, so very quickly, there are 4 categories of evidence, okay? High quality evidence, moderate quality evidence, low quality evidence, and very low quality evidence. And they're easy to understand, okay? High quality evidence is evidence that we're very confident lies very close to the true value of the recommendation. In other words, the probability is very low that further research will change the conclusions. Now, on the other hand, at the very bottom, very low quality evidence is evidence about which we have no confidence. We have no confidence in the evidence, in the recommendation. We instead are very certain that new research will completely alter the conclusions that are presented. And so we're going to look at some examples here so that we can understand this point, okay? How would you rate these recommendations, okay? So first recommendation, getting enough sleep is a critical factor for improving one's treatment outcome. Number 2, so therefore I'd like you to just, think, is this a high quality recommendation? Is it a moderate quality? Is it a very low quality recommendation? Secondly, the recommendation that a trusting relationship with one's medical team while undergoing treatment for cancer reduces ignorance and wrong expectations. Number 3, soaking ladies' fingers in a jug of water overnight and then drinking the water the next day, and doing this faithfully for 3 months will help one lose weight. So let's do the first one, okay? I'm going to ask for some responses. So please shout out your rating. Getting enough sleep is critical for improving one's treatment outcome. What do you think that is?
Hi.
Hi. 10.
Who's that?
Jane, I say 10.
Jane, 10, is it? No,
Yeah.
you don't. It's not 10 upon 10. Is it high quality evidence, moderate quality evidence, low quality, very low quality?
high quality.
High quality, says Jane. Okay. Any alternate views? Let's ask Wee Ping. Getting enough sleep is critical for improving one's outcome.
Yes, I think I don't see it so critical. I think it's moderate. Yeah.
Moderate. Okay, very good. Okay, next one. A trusting relationship, a good relationship with your doctors and nurses reduces ignorance and wrong expectations. Let's ask Felicia.
Moderate to high?
Moderate high, okay. Let's ask Setiong.
A moderate.
Moderate, okay, good. And then finally, ladies' fingers.
Very low.
Felicia says very low. Okay, all right. So here are the answers, okay? Getting enough sleep is a low quality evidence. Yeah. So very often, yeah, so therefore we have assumptions, you know. Lay people have assumptions. You must sleep 8 hours, 10 hours a day, but there is no evidence. In fact, so therefore the quality of the evidence that is available is low. This one is high quality, and this one is very low quality. Meaning to say that you drink ladies' fingers for 3 months, you're not going to lose weight. So if you want to try, you can try, but you know, maybe you shouldn't even try. I'm going to move on to the topic of cancer, because we are a cancer support group, and when you care for cancer patients, there are additional dimensions that you need to be aware of. So first of all, I'm going to show you 3 photos. The first photo is this one, which is the picture of a man with cancer, and he's with his caregiver. And I wonder what you feel and what you think when you see a photo like this. Are you turned off? Are you frightened? Would you rather not look at a photo like this? So, and when we have a patient with cancer, this is often this is sometimes, let's not say often, this is sometimes the person that you would deal with. And so therefore, we need our caregivers to be prepared for images like these. So this is a man with cancer of the lung, and he is emaciated, which means he's lost a lot of weight. And you can see how much weight he has lost. And I think his caregiver, who may be his wife, may be giving him a massage. Maybe he's having some pain at the back. And until and unless you become comfortable with the reality, the task of caregiving can be that much more difficult for you. Second picture. So this is a picture of a man lying on the bed, and there is a nurse who's standing up, and she is adjusting a drip, an infusion bottle. And at the back is a woman who is probably the caregiver and probably the wife. Okay, and again, I don't know what you feel when you see a picture like this. What are your emotions? And so therefore, if you have ever cared for a person with cancer, and if you are the one who accompanies that person to the hospital, this is part of your job description. You have to go to the hospital with the person whom you're caring for. And I know sometimes we struggle with hospitals, and I'll tell you I'll give you some examples of the emotions that you might feel. You might feel intimidated by the hospital. You might feel very uncomfortable with the hospital. It's a frightening place. You don't ever want to go back there again. You might feel very confused because it's such a big place and everyone is very busy and you're lost. You cannot find your way around the hospital. And maybe one day at the hospital, you asked for directions, and the person who gave you directions was very rude or very curt, and you felt that you were put down by what he said to you, and that worsened the experience for you. And maybe at the end of the hospital visit or the clinic visit, you felt exhausted and you felt embarrassed by one thing or another. And the thought that you will be coming back to the hospital again and again and again is an unhappy thought for you. And obviously the caregiver, who is a first-time caregiver, would be unfamiliar with the hospital environment, and she would probably not know what the nurse is doing. And she might see her job as the person who accompanies the patient, and anything more than that, she can't really do it, and she needs to learn, and she's afraid to learn, and there are too many things to learn, and she cannot remember what the nurse had told her. So all of this can be very intimidating to the caregiver. And then, of course, we have this photo. What if your wife loses all her hair? Do you remember how she reacted to losing her hair? What are your own feelings about her hair? Did you feel embarrassed that she had no hair? Did you feel ashamed of her? Did you feel very impatient with her because she made such a fuss over her hair? And have you not gotten into a quarrel with her over her hair? In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, we have the story of the Good Samaritan. And so my question to you is, was the Good Samaritan a caregiver? And if he was a caregiver in the story, was he a good caregiver? Okay, so I'm going to just spend about 5 minutes here, and I'd like to hear what you think about this question. So the Good Samaritan, there was a man, and he was robbed, and he was beaten up, and he was left for dead in a ditch. And then along the road came a priest, and the priest looked the other way. Then the next person who came down the road was a Levite, and the Levite also tried to siam. And then finally we had the Samaritan. Now the Samaritan, of course, the Samaritans are enemies with the Jews, and they would have nothing to do with the Jews. But interestingly, in this parable that Jesus told, the Samaritan was the one who helped the man who was left for dead in the ditch. And if you turn to Luke chapter 10, 25 to 37, if you have, shall we just quickly look at that passage and just see what exactly the Good Samaritan did. When the Samaritan saw the man, he had compassion. This is verse 33. And then he went to him and he bound up his wounds, and he poured on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." So this was what the Samaritan did. So do you think he was a caregiver? And if so, do you think he was a good caregiver? Any volunteers?
I shall read my answer.
Yes.
I think he's a good caregiver because he personally attended to the wound of this injured guy. And that is the personal touch, the personal compassion, the personal involvement. And he bound up his wound, got him to a safe place that he know the innkeeper will take care of this guy. Not every innkeeper will do it, but he probably is assured that this innkeeper will do a good job. And he is able to leave this man to the care of the innkeeper, telling the innkeeper that whatever expenses he incur, don't worry, he will be reimbursed. Because he himself cannot be there to give care. He has other duties. So he finds someone whom he can trust. And in this case, he's able to afford to pay for the substitute caregiving. So I think he's a good caregiver.
Wikwi, what do you think?
I would say that it's a stranger. He did what he can, but if for our own relative, you just put him in the community hospital like that, then he say, I pay you all the money, all that, then that's it, is it? So it's two different circumstances. As a stranger, he is a good Samaritan. He really do all the things. But if our loved one, we should stay with the person.
Well, thanks very much, Wikwi and Jane. So interestingly, you have slightly differing views from each other, and I think both of you have answered the question correctly. The question that was posed in this parable was, who is your neighbor? This was the question that the Pharisees asked Jesus, and Jesus used the Samaritan to illustrate who the neighbor was. The priest was not the neighbor, the Levite was not the neighbor, but the Samaritan surprisingly was the neighbor. And of course, we know that as Christians, we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves. So therefore, the Samaritan was definitely the good neighbor, unlike the priest and the Levite. And Wikwi, of course, pointed out the Samaritan may not have been a true caregiver because he did attend to the man in the ditch. He bound up his wounds, he put him on his donkey, and he brought him to the inn, and then he paid money. So maybe there's a bit of caregiving in that, and maybe not, because the actual work of caregiving was not done by the Samaritan. It was done perhaps by the innkeeper. But it's an interesting story. I think you'll agree that that when we talk about caregiving, there are many dimensions. The basic impulse beneath caregiving is the impulse of love and care. But caregiving can be distinguished by a few other things. The fact that it is ongoing, it goes on and on usually. It is not a one-time or two-time encounter, but it is often a job that can go on for a long time. Now, we're going to talk about compassion fatigue. And so compassion fatigue is a condition that can happen to us when we've been in a role that demands compassion for too long. Okay, we are very fatigued. We have no more compassion anymore. And so compassion fatigue is a condition that is characterized by exhaustion, leading to a diminished ability to empathize. And also, this is described as the negative cost of caring. Compassion fatigue, of course, can be seen in many vocations. Firstly, if you work with victims of disaster, victims of trauma and illness, if you're in the healthcare industry, we often experience compassion fatigue. Then the other helping professions are also at risk of compassion fatigue. And these include child protection workers, clergy, teachers, social workers, palliative care workers, and even student affairs professionals. So these are jobs where you may be particularly vulnerable to experiencing compassion fatigue. Then, of course, even non-professionals, family members, can experience compassion fatigue. But if it is someone whom you love, say you're caring for your father, perhaps you have a larger store of love for your father, and you can go on for longer, and you will not feel exhausted as quickly compared to if you were caring for someone whom you don't know. Now, here is an interesting article from the New York Times, and it is really about a book that was written by a woman who suddenly found herself caring for her husband. And we'll just read the headlines here: the costly, painful, lonely burden of care. And we're told that healthcare in the US relies on an invisible army of caregivers, and these are mostly women. And for many of these women, their careers can get stunted, they lose earnings, they become exhausted, and this is all part of the fallout. And the author, who is Kate Washington, says, if society wants us to keep caring for others, it's going to have to show a little bit more care for us. Okay, so this is the preamble to the book. In 1921, Kate Washington's world changed. Her husband, Brad Buchanan, was late for family dinner, and then she found him in the bathroom, coughing out blood, a lot of blood. She handed him a bucket and asked the neighbor to watch her 2 young daughters while she drove him to the emergency room. And the doctors found that a tumor had ruptured in his lungs and he urgently needed chemotherapy. So this is the illustration for the article. You see in this illustration a woman, and she is holding in her hand a bed, and in the bed is a man. And this is Kate Washington caring for her husband, and her husband is the burden on her. And you can see there are also blue waves in this picture, illustrating the turmoil that she felt as she cared for her husband. So who was Kate Washington? Well, she was a young professional. Her husband was also a young professional. They had 2 young children. And Brad's diagnosis of a lymphoma stripped these identities away, and he became a patient and she became his caregiver. And Brad's cancer was aggressive, and it necessitated a stem cell transplant that triggered a massive infection. And that infection robbed him of his eyesight and nearly his life. And Kate became his full-time aide to keep him alive. She coordinated his treatments, she made doctor's appointments, she called insurance, she filled dozens of prescriptions, she cleaned the commodes, she gave IV drugs. And her book is the story of one woman's struggle to care for her seriously ill husband. And it's a revealing look at the role unpaid family caregivers play in a society that fails to produce them with, to provide them with structural support. Okay, we're going to just go down a list of some of the things that caregivers may have to learn to do. First of all, if you're caring for someone who has cancer, you may have to learn how to give oxygen and to manage oxygen. You would have to learn what to do if your patient refuses food. And this is often a problematic topic. So I'm going to just expand a bit about food. Every now and then you may find yourself, when you're caring for, say, your husband, you might find that your husband is refusing your food. And you've prepared a nice lunch or a nice dinner for him, but he doesn't want to eat your food. It's important for us in that situation to remember that your husband's refusal of food is not a refusal of you, and he's not pushing you away. It is a reflection of his illness. Suppose you've gone out of your way to buy nice meal from outside for your wife, and then she says, no, I don't want to eat, and you feel rejected. But it's important for us to remember that she is not pushing you away. And it is important to remember that medications can affect taste and appetite. And when that happens, you may feel frustrated. you may feel that the food is extremely important, and therefore you may be tempted to stop his pills out of desperation. But clearly that would be the wrong thing to do without consulting your healthcare team. So I think when you're in a situation like that as a caregiver, you should take a step back and not let your emotions take over. And you should maybe wait and ask him again, do you want to eat your lunch? And very often the patient may say, okay, I can have the lunch now. Now, if you imagine this happening to you 5 times a week, you can understand the fatigue you will feel as a caregiver. And if you care and you love the person that you're caring for, it is often easy for us to see that as a rejection and take it personally. I think it's important for us to remember that having meals together are times of connection and relating. And so therefore, I think even if she takes 2 hours to finish the meal, it may be worthwhile sitting there for 2 hours with her through that meal. Then the third line there is how to manage incontinence. Incontinence is what happens if you lose control of your bladder, lose control of your bowels. And so therefore you wet the bed or you soil your pants. What do you do? Obviously, I think if you are an experienced caregiver, you have done this 50 times and you can handle it. But if it is happening for the first time or second time, it may be quite a struggle. And this is just another aspect of the day-to-day things that you have to do that can wear you down. Sometimes caregivers are also required to clean and dress wounds at home. And of course, if you are a layperson, you have never cleaned a wound before and you just don't know what to do it, how to do it, and you are not confident and you're afraid you will do the wrong thing. But over time, I think many of us can be taught how to do these tasks very competently. And again, the fact that this goes on for a long time can be a big problem. Now, what if her skin tears, or how to get him from bed to wheelchair to shower? He's so heavy, I cannot carry him. And what happens if she falls at home? Suppose one day she fell and you are horrified that she fell, even though you were in the house with her, and you will feel very guilty. You might feel very guilty that you have allowed her to fall. And then, of course, the emotions will come in. And then finally, a very simple thing, a very practical thing, like how to insert a rectal suppository. Now, so because of these difficulties, very often families decide that they cannot cope anymore and they cannot be the caregiver anymore, and they would therefore turn to an alternate agent. And in Singapore, this is often a nursing home. Suppose you've cared for your husband for 8 months and you can't do it anymore, and you have no children, or the children just cannot chip in. Then you might turn to assisted living, and in Singapore, that usually means a nursing home. There is the topic of guilt. Caregivers often experience guilt, and they feel that if they did not take on the job of caregiving, then they have not acted honorably. If you're a child and you decide, no, I cannot care for my father, you might feel guilty because you might feel that you're not a good daughter. Or if the wife says, I cannot care for my husband anymore, she might feel, oh, I'm a bad wife. After 20 years of marriage, 30 years of marriage, I cannot do it. There's just immense guilt that you might feel because you've made a promise in sickness and in health to care for for the man that you married. And so therefore we have statistics that tell us that 82% of people find difficulty saying no to the job. And 54% feel guilty about taking a break. And 29% spend 40 hours a week and they cannot sleep, and they do very badly in their jobs, assuming that they even have jobs anymore. And some 44% feel that they cannot find someone else to take over the job. They are stuck. And so therefore, the caregiver sometimes experiences declining health himself, and the stress increases over time as the recipient of the care ages or as his condition worsens. So this is a story of a man called David, who is 53 years old. And one morning, his mother, who is 79 years old, woke up and she couldn't move her legs. And the hospital said she had a stroke. Now, even though her prognosis was very grim, David decided to bring his mom home. And the doctor asked him, "Do you know what you're in for?" And David said, "Yes, I think I know what to do. I've lived with my mother and I'm used to lifting her out of bed and into wheelchairs." And David knew that he would have to lift his mother throughout the day, help her to shower, to dress, to use the bathroom. What he didn't realize was that his own health as a caregiver and his life as a caregiver would affect his health. And of course, the thought that was in David's head very often was this one: if I got hurt, who is going to take care of her? And so there was the desperation and the anxiety that happened to David. And so David's blood pressure rose. And one day while lifting his mother, he had a slipped disc. And it was so painful that he had to put his mother down very quickly. And so he put her mother down on the toilet. And his mother had to sit on the toilet for 2 hours because he was in such pain. And then later on, David even underwent a colonoscopy without anesthesia because he was afraid that if he had anesthesia, he would not wake up and he would not be able to attend to his mother's call. And so therefore, even though his own body fell apart, David insisted on remaining his mother's caregiver. I'm going to go to the last part now, which are the emotional symptoms of burnout. And after I'm done with the emotional symptoms, I'm going to talk about the spiritual symptoms of burnout. So first of all, you have emotional exhaustion. Some of us may feel numb or hardened, while others of us may feel emotional about everything. So sometimes we will lose our emotions. We can't feel anymore. But at other times, our emotions are heightened. Every little thing sets us off. These are both signs of emotional exhaustion. Then there are feelings of dread. Feelings of dread are also an emotional symptom of burnout. So this is the feeling that something awful would happen. You're just sure that something terrible will happen today. It's a feeling of dread. It's also a symptom of burnout. Fear. Sometimes we fear failure. Sometimes we fear that we will be discovered and exposed for being lousy caregivers. Sometimes we feel frightened for our own health. And sometimes we fear even the telephone ringing. And some of these fears, therefore, can be very irrational. But if you are caught up in the fear, you would not necessarily think that it is irrational. There's a persecution complex. And sometimes caregivers begin to feel that they're being discussed about behind their backs. And therefore, this becomes eventually into paranoia, and they fear being criticized for how they're doing as caregivers, and they sense that people are talking behind their backs. There's usually a loss of optimism. There's little enthusiasm for anything. And if you give helpful suggestions, you may receive a negative response from the person with burnout. There's a loss of courage. And even simple things become difficult things. And this is particularly true for people who have received criticism for for the work that they are doing. If you're criticized, you will lose courage. A loss of self-esteem. There's a diminishing sense of self-worth and self-respect. And if you're talking about church pastors and ministers, the loss of self-esteem may cause them sometimes to leave the church ministry. And finally, depression can set in when you are burnt out. Now then, here are the spiritual symptoms of burnout. There is a lack of enthusiasm for the spiritual life. You may feel disconnected from your church, from your DG, from your church friends, and there's a lack of enthusiasm for the Christian life. Sometimes there is anger with God, and we often feel that our suffering is undeserved and that God has sometimes failed us, and we become angry with God. Sometimes you may begin to doubt the reality of God, and you doubt that God really exists. Guilt. So very often there's a sense of guilt, and the sense of guilt makes your work ineffective. And we often call this a desert experience, where you feel very dry and you find that you cannot find any oasis of meaning in your world. We sometimes withdraw from other people. We may avoid situations that previously we were enthusiastic about. We may become less approachable by other people. And we may begin to experience family problems because of our burnout. We lose the ability to control our emotions. We are less sensitive to other people. We are less aware of other people. And therefore, we often become more difficult to live with. Then very quickly, there's sometimes an openness to sin as well. One of the most destructive effects of burnout is the increased susceptibility to sin. The temptations that previously you were able to fight, you may find yourself that you are not able to resist them anymore, and the old sins may return. And sometimes new sins may develop. We become less productive. We want to give up. Now, how do we find a way out of burnout? First of all, I think we need to remember that our burnout is not a sin. It is not a sin to feel tired. Fatigue is not a sin. It's just a symptom of our limitedness. And we are not made of iron. Now, so tiredness itself is not sin, but if we are not careful, we can fall into sin. Then the other way out of burnout is we need to know when to say no. And this is easy to understand because there are two main groups of duties. There is, first of all, mandatory duties. And then secondly, we have voluntary duties. So the mandatory duties are those that we need to do, that are given to us by God. And these mandatory duties include childbearing, homemaking, earning a living, caring for our parents. And voluntary duties are things that you volunteer for. And this is often sometimes very hard to categorize, and it's very hard to draw lines between what is voluntary and mandatory. The Presbyterian Church, I think all of us know in particular, believes very strongly in the priesthood of all believers, maybe more so than the Methodist Church or the Anglican Church. And so therefore, we have a huge volunteer force in Presbyterian churches. And if you grow up in a Presbyterian church, sometimes you may find it hard to say no. We have this interesting verse from the Song of Solomon. They made me keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. And so, brothers and sisters, it is important for us to remember that our own vineyard is our first priority. Now, we'll just go back to caregiving. Is caregiving something that you can really say no to? Is caregiving mandatory or voluntary? And you see how difficult this question is. Because most of the time, or often enough of the time, caregiving is not voluntary. If it is your husband, if it is your wife, if it is your son, it is perhaps not voluntary because you are the loved one, and by default, you are the first caregiver. Now, I'm going to close now, and I'm going to share with us what I think is an interesting example of caregiving in the Bible. I was racking my brain to try and think of an instance in the Bible where we have an account of caregiving. And I thought of Jesus on the cross. And we have this short episode in John's Gospel where we have Jesus on the cross. And let's just read this. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to his disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. And the disciple, of course, is the disciple whom Jesus loved, John the Evangelist, or St. John the Divine. My thought was, did Jesus make John the caregiver of his mother? It certainly seems so to me. Somehow, when Jesus was on the cross, he saw his mother, he saw John, and he gave his mother to John and asked John to look after his mother. Now, we don't know very much from the Bible what happened afterwards. How did John look after Mary? In fact, we don't know a lot about John, apart from the fact that he wrote 3 letters and that he wrote the Revelation to St. John. Did John become a caregiver, and in what way did he become a caregiver? Did Jesus decide to find a caregiver for his mother because his mother was not well? We don't know, but I think in this story, at the conclusion of John's Gospel, we have a beautiful account of caregiving, a beautiful account of the beginning of caregiving that we can learn from, and that shows to us the heart behind caregiving. Now, what can a caregiver pray for? Now, this is the kind of prayer that I think I would pray. I would pray like this: Lord, I entrust to your heart my vocation of caregiving. I'm the caregiver. Caregiving is the vocation that God has given me. It's the job that God has given me. And so therefore I would pray, Lord, I entrust to your heart my vocation of caregiving. Lord, let me make every person who approaches me in need feel special. Let me make the person I'm caring for today feel special. Let me make the person I've looked after for 8 months feel special. I would pray, Lord, I am discouraged and I'm tired. I need comfort. Comfort can be found in Jesus's heart, which beats for us to the rhythm of his words. Have courage, do not be afraid. I am here. And I would pray, Lord, we ask for grace to become passionate about people who suffer, passionate about service, so that the church pulsates with a heart of love. And I would pray, Lord, I cannot do this alone. I want to stop. I want to give up. My siblings have not helped me. I need to make a living. I've neglected my children. Help me to find solutions. Help me to get through this week, through this one day. Dear God, we thank you that before anything else existed, you existed. And we thank you that your being there at the very beginning is the starting point of caregiving. We thank you that all of caregiving springs from the idea of human value, that we are valuable enough to be cared for, that there is something unique about us that makes caring not a waste of time. We acknowledge too that caregiving also springs from love, not just the reality of human value, but from love. And love exists because you are a God of love. And all caregiving, even if it were not to someone who is related to us, all caregiving springs from love. So we ask that you will enlarge our hearts of love, that we will not run dry, and that if we do run dry, you will replenish us and refresh us so that our hearts of love will be filled again